This is our last discussion of the series, and we're going to be talking about the world of Ezra and Nehemiah and some archaeological insights. This will not have quite as much of a preachy element to it. I'm not apologizing for that, nor am I whatever. Okay. It's just sort of the way it fleshes out here. But I do want to look at some of the issues going on. There are some really interesting insights into some of the circumstances that are unfolding. This one actually is more of a historical integration of what's happening in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. And as we look at this, we begin with a map of the Persian Empire. This is pretty much at its maximum. Persian Empire, relative to its predecessors, was huge. Now, with each successive empire, territory gets larger. The Greeks are going to be more than this. The Romans are going to be even more than that. So you have this sort of enlarging effect. But the Persians have an empire that goes all the way from India over here into Greece, and we're going to talk about that, and down into Egypt. And these issues, particularly in the western part of the empire, play in the background, significant background, to the narration that we have in the Bible. Now, I mentioned earlier in one of the sessions, I don't remember, well, it must have been the last one, where God is using Cyrus in a way that Cyrus is not aware. Okay. God uses circumstances in ways that the people who are the active participants may not realize what's going on. Whenever God, for instance, talks to Hezekiah, and he will talk about Isaiah through to Judah, God will talk in terms of using Assyria as his rod of anger in his hand. Now, I doubt seriously the Assyrians understood that. The Bible certainly is focusing upon God's activity, but sometimes people don't always understand what they're doing. And I want to emphasize that as we move into this discussion. To set some scenes, we're going to look at some chronology of the Achaemenids, which I realize is something everybody really jumps right on, and to set the scene here. And actually there's a date prior to this that becomes very important. Most of you are familiar with well, maybe you aren't, I don't know. In Western civilization, United States, we don't often keep up with some of this. But in 490 BC, there was a very, very significant battle that took place between the Persians and the Greeks. Now, the Greeks, being somewhat precocious as they were precipitating and sponsoring some rebellion in western Turkey against the Persians. Now, the Persians are a little ticked at this. Okay, they don't appreciate the Greek interference in their national affairs. And so Darius decides he's going to invade Greece and punish these folks. Well, he attempts to do so. And there's this big battle that takes place at a place called Marathon. And the Greeks, if you remember the story, the Greeks resoundingly defeat them at Marathon. And the Persians are utterly embarrassed. One of the soldiers from the Greek army runs back to Athens to report the victory over the Persians, 26.2 miles. That's why marathons are called marathons, 26.2 miles. I'm not one of those people, okay? I probably don't look like one, but I have no interest whatsoever in running either a full marathon or a half marathon. Sharon and I, however, did run in the 2,500th anniversary of the Battle of Marathon. We ran about 20 yards. We walked 5K, but we can say in that 2,500th anniversary, we ran in the marathon. At least I did. I don't remember for sure whether she did. I think she did fewer yards than I. But anyway, a great event in Western civilization. Well, the problem that arises is Darius' successor, Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, wants to retaliate. The Persians are humiliated by this. I mean, especially the kind of defeat it was. And so he is determined, we're going to go back and we're going to punish those Greeks for what they've done. So, the Bible opens in the book of Esther. There is this gathering in Susa where they're trying to figure out, and if you actually look and read this carefully, it appears, and most scholars recognize, this is actually a war plan party where they're gathering together and making plans to invade Greece again. and punish Greece. Within that setting, they get in sort of this drunken stupor. They invite Vashti to come in and show off her beauty. Admittedly, all kinds of issues raised there. She refuses to go. Everybody gets ticked off because of the insubordination of the queen. And she is banished from being queen anymore. There's set up a scenario where there's going to be a replacement. In the meantime, Ahasuerus goes off to battle against the Greeks again and is resoundingly defeated at Salamis and then finally at Plataea. And finally, the Persians recognize this is not worth the hassle. Let's just leave these Greeks alone. He comes back, and you have the Battle of Plataea, and Esther becomes queen in 479, 478 BC. Some have suggested, not only this, but that Ahasuerus is sort of salving his wounds here in his new harem that he has adopted as a result of all of this. It's possible. Okay, I don't want to press that too far. In the meantime, the book of Esther will talk in terms of a number of years lapse, and of course the unfolding of all of that conflict between Haman and Mordecai. And finally, you have the death of Haman, and Mordecai is going to replace Haman as essentially the second in command in the country. And that takes place in 473, 472 BC. Now, the next king on the scene is Artaxerxes. This is where the book of Ezra and Nehemiah come into play, not the first part of the chapter. If you look at Ezra, chapters 1 through 6, all of those events take place before Esther. All of the events of Esther take place in a chronological gap between Ezra chapter 6 and the opening of chapter 7. Then you have the events in Ezra chapter 7 that begin with Ezra and Nehemiah as personalities. But in the meantime, the Persians aren't finished with these Greeks, because the Greeks have precipitated a rebellion in Egypt now in 461, 460 BC. Well, Ezra goes to Palestine. Have you ever wondered why the king was so willing to let Ezra go to Palestine? Don't know the answer to that. But it's not very long after all of this crisis, and it's certainly not very long after Mordecai replaces Haman. So we're looking at a very short distance. And Artaxerxes essentially is the son, it's obviously is the son of Ahasuerus, and he certainly would know who Esther is. Haman would have this significant role as second in the empire for, 8 years prior to Artaxerxes coming to the throne. So even if Haman is not in this position of influence when Artaxerxes takes the throne, he has to be familiar with who he was. He's not oblivious to the internal political activities in the land of Persia. To a large extent, we have to think, I think reasonably, that Artaxerxes has respect for these Jewish people. He knew a Jewish queen. He apparently has respect for a Jewish advisor, Ezra perhaps, and certainly a cupbearer who is Jewish. And hence, when these events begun to unfold, there apparently is a sympathy that he can trust these Jewish people. They're people of integrity, and they're people that he can put his confidence in. Now, there's another element that comes into play. Egypt is going to, the Greeks are going to try to get Egypt to rebel again, and they continue this process down to 450 BC. And it's in 445 that finally Nehemiah comes on the scene personally. And look at the intimacy between Artaxerxes and Nehemiah. There's no question, as Brother North told us last night, that there is an intimacy, there's an understanding, there's a camaraderie between the king and the cupbearer. But he obviously has a lot of trust in this cupbearer to send him and allow him to go on this mission. And many have proposed on a larger international scene that part of what is happening, and I don't think Artaxerxes knows what's going on, I think the Lord does. Artaxerxes probably is not aware of what God is doing, but he probably thinks, I want one of my most trusted advisors down there on that southern flank so that if something erupts in Egypt again, I'll have firsthand, I have a finger on the pulse of what's going on. And then you have Nehemiah coming in. Nehemiah's mission is not so much primarily political. Now, there is no question he is going to be a political entity. But his primary concern is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But think about the implications of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. That in and of itself is a military maneuver in a lot of ways. Certainly there's an identity of ethnicity that comes into play. There's a removal from this rank of embarrassment and shame and all of that. And Nehemiah comes in with that instrumentality. He's probably thinking more religious and as service to God, but Artaxerxes probably thinks it's best to have somebody I know and trust on that front line so that I can know what's happening as the Greeks attempt or might attempt to try to invade again from the south. It's a fascinating scenario. And it explains in a lot of ways what potentially is unfolding here. As we look at the narrative, we looked at this in the last session, Ezra's return is apparently the shorter route as he's attempting to get there as quickly as possible because of all that's unfolding. Now, as they arrive, the Bible tells us in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, that Nehemiah hears about the fact that the walls are in disarray in the month Kislev. And he's in agony, he's praying, he's concerned about all of this, but he does not overtly do anything for a while. But then in chapter 2, you have this narration where it's described explicitly, he's the cupbearer to the king, a very trusted position. Now, this is not actually a portrayal of Artaxerxes and Nehemiah. This is a cupbearer from another period, but the scenario would be similar. If you have a cupbearer, the idea in part, sort of the title is, you trust this individual that, I think this might be poison. Will you drink it? And of course, the cupbearer is not going to be willingly drinking poison and all this. And so this individual is a gatekeeper in a very real, significant way. And in this scenario, you would have Nehemiah in this very trusted role of a comrade, of an advisor, of a confidant that Artaxerxes has available. But the Bible tells us in chapter 2, verse 1, that overtly Nehemiah doesn't do anything until the month Nisan. Nothing to do with an automobile. And in the month of Nisan, he comes in before the king. Now, this is 4 months that have lapsed, within which time he apparently has done nothing in regards to the king, but I picture him agonizing over this. What do I do? How do I approach the king? How do I address this? What can I do? The kind of agony sometimes that you and I will confront. And most of us at one time or another, especially if we have any years on us at all, have had to agonize over certain questions. What do I do with the health of my deteriorating parents? And how do I deal with all of these circumstances of turmoil and so forth? And I picture Nehemiah sort of wrestling with what this is all about and how to proceed. But one day he comes in before the king, and the king says, "Something's wrong. Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was much afraid. Sorry for the typo. All right, it's embarrassing. Then I was afraid. Now, at this point, the question in of itself is interesting. And I think we need at least to recognize the possibility of a few scenarios that might lurk in the back of Artaxerxes' mind. One is, certainly Artaxerxes had earlier issued the decree to stop the construction of the walls. This is narrated in Ezra chapter 4, a very odd chapter. It's very difficult to sort through elements of Ezra chapter 4. But this is a characteristic kind of opposition that the Hebrew people have confronted as they've tried to deal with rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the walls, and it goes all the way down to this period. But Artaxerxes is involved in having the wall construction stop. And I can imagine some reluctance, in a sense, on Nehemiah's part to come in and ask the king to reverse an order. Most leaders are not real gung-ho for you to come in and tell them they're wrong. And not that that's what really Nehemiah is going to do, but he undoubtedly would be wrestling with, how do I breach this subject in a meaningful way that does not compromise or threaten the integrity of the king? Even though he is a confidant, he's still an underling. And so I can easily imagine some anxiety, some trepidation on his part as he is trying to figure out how to do this. But finally he comes in, and this look on his face, and the king responds, "This is nothing but sadness." I can imagine the king, "Do you know of a conspiracy against me?" I mean, the cupbearer is the one who's sort of the gatekeeper of his life. Do you know a conspiracy against me? And if Nehemiah has any affection for the king whatsoever, there would be a sadness of some kind. Or there may be another one. Do you know of something or someone conspiring against me in any kind of way? Whether it's necessarily to snuff out my life. But the king recognizes this is something, do you really care? Is it something that is really meaningful to you, Nehemiah? And of course, you don't want a disgruntled cupbearer on your hands. And so for the king to ask the question is in his self-interest, certainly, to find out what's bothering you, Nehemiah. You don't want an unhappy cupbearer. You're not quite sure what one would do. I'm not questioning at all Nehemiah's integrity. Well, Nehemiah's going to let him know. He points out in the 20th year, which is 445 BC as we talk in terms of, but this is 13 years after Ezra has arrived. Soon after one of those rebellions that we're narrating, that at least went up to 450 BC. Now, how much is ongoing is open to question. Nehemiah arrives in the province of Yehud, is how typically the ancient world would refer to Judea. He arrives with a royal escort. Chapter 2, verse 9, the text is very clear. He comes on the scene. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Imagine that you are the previous administrator. Now, whether the previous administrator knows that he's about to be replaced or not, it's open to question. But here comes a representative of the king with letters and horses and horsemen and soldiers and everything else. And Nehemiah arrives on the scene with this entourage. Are you here to replace me? Now, the ones under consideration here are Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. And with the arrival of Nehemiah with this military entourage, you can easily imagine them starting to feel threatened. Why are you here? And of course, the animosity that immediately kicks into play. And that is exactly what happens. Now, what necessarily drives it all, the Bible does not narrate, but it's easy to imagine the scenario unfolding. Now, Sanballat the Horonite apparently comes from either Upper or Lower Beth Horon, hence the Horonite element, which is sort of on the western flank of the Central Hills as you slope down into the Shephelah, or the coastal plain. He is described in some of the literature of antiquity as a governor of Samaria. So he's the fellow that's in charge. And here comes Nehemiah, who's going to be in charge. So immediately there's this threat. It's sort of the animosity that exists between the previous president and the new president. We will not pursue that. All right. Regardless of, what direction we're going to be going here. And Tobiah the Ammonite, there is some question as to whether he has any kind of Israelite connection. A lot of scholars say he's not an Israelite. However, his name means Yahweh is good. All right. Well, why does he refer to him as Yahweh in his name? Now, admittedly, a theophoric name does not intrinsically identify religious affiliation and connections, although normally it does in some fashion. But we know from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 41, that there was a conspiracy on the part of some individuals to kill Gedaliah, and they fled into the Ammonite territory. And some have suggested maybe Tobiah is the family of that flight from Judea back at the time of the Nebuchadnezzar crisis. Okay, there's a possibility. But anyway, he in a sense would be ethnically removed, certainly territorially removed from the core area of Yehud, but he's kept certainly his finger in the pie or his thumb on the scale or whatever imagery you want to use here. He's involved in the activities, and certainly the narrative is going to delineate a lot of that. But the Ammonites, no matter how you look at them, have been perennial enemy of the Israelites. Over and over and over and over again, the Ammonites and the Israelites have never really gotten along very well. And here Tobiah is associated with them. So you have this sort of historic, and if you've noticed, memories in that part of the world are really long. And we're still wrestling with elements of that. So this is part of the scene as he arrives. Now, we know part of the issue. Not only is it known as Yehud, but we have found in excavations these jar handles that have a stamp on them that say Yehud, which is the title of the arena. Probably these are jars that would be collecting taxes and revenue and grain and so forth, which, by the way, there are allusions to this kind of thing in the book of Nehemiah itself, as Nehemiah lambast the children of Israel for taking the taxes, the usury laws, and so forth, and he finally persuades them to back off of elements of that. Now, that didn't necessarily preclude taxes being paid to the king, but nonetheless, the oppression of the administrators in Judah are told to back off, and they agree to do so. And the Bible narrates their willingness at least to comply, at least in the face of a powerful personality such as Nehemiah. Now, this is usually thought to be, and we're not exactly sure the boundaries that are involved, but the green area is usually understood to be sort of the boundary of Yehud. Jerusalem is situated right in the middle, good location for it. Now, the plain of Ono that plays into the narrative is over here. And it's interesting in this attempt on the part of Sanballat and others to get him into the plain of Ono, in part is to get him out of the territory where Nehemiah would be able to call his own backup. And so there's a different turf that might be involved. And also sort of away from the population center that would make it more difficult for someone to rescue Nehemiah should they be able to succeed in this effort to try and derail him. So the territory is not large. This would be part of what we would call Samaria later time, and not quite as far down south as we normally think in terms of Old Testament Judah. It's fairly small, quite restricted in area. Now, Nehemiah arrives, and one of the first things he does is to do a survey. Now, here's a map of the city, and apparently he begins his night journey at about that point. Now, this is the city that we're under consideration, where they want to rebuild the walls and so forth. The temple has by this point been reconstructed, but the walls are still torn down. And so he begins roughly that point, and he goes down to the south on his beast, and then he gets off the beast and goes up the eastern slope, because apparently the rubble's so bad. Now, if you have any understanding of this is not dating to Nehemiah, but this is the kind of thing you need to envision. These are some of the stones left behind at the western wall that the Romans, in the destruction of the city, just toppled over the top and left lying on the ground. And you notice this huge depression right here on the left side of the screen. This was all full, sort of like further down. Rubble everywhere, and all of this falls down, and this crushes the pavement beneath. And that was how, basically, the archaeologists found all of this region in the excavation. Now, the reason I bring this up is because that eastern slope would have probably looked very similar, with the broken down walls, all the rubble, and then it cascading down the slope, which is fairly steep. And as Nehemiah arrives with his donkey, probably, even the donkey can't quite make it over all this, so Nehemiah gets off the donkey, rumbles his way through the debris, surveying the situation, and finally then goes back into the city to begin his effort to rebuild these walls with the authority of the king. Part of the rationale, of course, is that we may no longer suffer derision. Part of the identity of a people was that their capital town have an integrity to it. Jerusalem had failed to measure up to this. I appreciated Brother Otey's discussion last night. Sometimes people just sort of get used to the norm. Sometimes you have to have an outsider come in and rattle the cage a bit in order for people to wake up and realize, things can be better than this. And Nehemiah comes with exactly that mission. I don't know why Ezra wasn't able to pull it off, but nonetheless, Nehemiah comes with the force of the empire, if you will, behind him. And he's able to accomplish this. He has a greater political savvy than apparently Ezra does, and can bring the weight of the empire along with him. However, certainly Nehemiah is going to find opposition. Not minor opposition. This is big stuff. In the form of Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, Geshem the Arab, and they accuse him of rebelling against the king. Of all the charges to level against Nehemiah, this is probably the most stupid one, because he comes with the authority of the king. But of course, they're on the periphery of all of this. Nehemiah could very easily, I'm sure, sort of brought out the scroll. Here's my authority. See the king's signature on this? I've got everything I need. Leave me alone. But you know how people sometimes can be. If they can simply foment rebellion and insurrection among the population, whether Nehemiah has legitimate authority or not, if they can get the people disrupted in all of this so that they do not follow, then Nehemiah's efforts to a large extent are quashed. And this apparently seems to be ultimately the goal that Sanballat and Tobiah have in all of this. But Nehemiah points out to them that Sanballat, Tobiah, nor Geshem have any portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Now think about this for a minute. Sanballat is the governor of Samaria. These are people that do not have any particular connection with the temple in Jerusalem. He's sort of overlooking this, or looking over all of this on his own. But yes, there is a Samaria here, but he's not apparently Israelite in any overt sense of the term. Tobiah is an Ammonite in this association, and the Ammonites do not have this intrinsic connection into the temple. Geshem is an Arab. He doesn't have any particular connection. Why are they the ones governing Judah? Why are they governing the area that belongs to God, where Jerusalem, the city of God, is located? You have no right, portion or right or claim in the city of Jerusalem. And his line of argumentation is dead on target. He is a politician. He may not know construction techniques, but he knows how to run the show. And he's smart enough to have other folks around who at least do know the construction techniques. This is a really nifty map. I don't know. I got it on the internet and kind of thing. But this has to do with all of those sections of the wall that are built by the different tribes and families and so forth. Now, north, please understand, north is that way. Okay, it's not straight up. We're not accustomed to looking at a map of Jerusalem sideways. All right, but north is to the left-hand side of this, and the temple is situated over here, and you have this sort of amoeba-looking kind of orientation here. All the colors represent different groupings that are delineated within the biblical text. Just sort of as an interesting aside, I've often wondered, I wonder how unevenly construction the techniques were in all of these sections of the wall. I don't know. It's a tantalizing question, but anyway, there's no indication within the biblical text that the quality of construction varied significantly. And I would like to think Nehemiah, and at least whoever he has involved, would be overseeing that it's reasonably consistent. There is a reference to the junction of the broad wall that I want to bring up. The broad wall, if you've been to Jerusalem, you likely have seen this. It's a fascinating remnant of the city from the time of Hezekiah and later. And the broad wall, this is the remnant that you can fairly easily see. The Israelites were not real creative in how they name things, like archaeologists do bills. Okay. It's called a broad wall because it's a thick wall. All right. That's sort of the end of the discussion. It's about 25 feet thick. I think that qualifies for a broad wall. It's almost a double wide. Maybe that'll help us explain Rahab a little bit. I don't know. But anyway, but here is the broad wall that is there. This is the foundation of the broad wall. It would have had a superstructure of some kind, which of course is missing. This was not identified until the excavations ensued here after the Six-Day War in 1967. And the Israelis come in with a feverish tempo. They've taken the old city, the modern old city, and they're going to excavate as much as they can, as quickly as they can, thinking that someday they may have to turn it back over to the Arabs. And we're still wrestling with that. But anyway, that's modern politics situation. But they uncovered this. Now, on the right-hand side, right over here, here's the big, thick, broad wall. Right over here, there's a remnant of a wall that goes underneath the other. So if you think in terms of that little wall, and here's the big, broad wall. Can you sort of see the stratigraphy? Archaeologists love stratigraphy. This is almost as fun as latrines. All right. If you weren't here for the previous session, that won't mean anything to you. But we get really excited about this. But in Isaiah chapter 22, Isaiah talks about the construction of the broad wall. And he's lambasting the children of Israel, not Hezekiah, but the children of Israel for apparently their overconfidence in the construction of this wall. And he talks about them breaking down the houses in order to build this wall. And here you have a marvelous example of them having torn down these houses and built this wall over the rest of it. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar comes through, they destroy all of this. And this is not rebuilt, but it comes back to the broad wall would come in from the west side and junction about right there. So you have this geographic reference point in Nehemiah that then becomes a significant historical point of reference at an earlier point in the history of the children of Israel. Now, in rebuilding the walls, these gates typically have names for a reason. They're not usually memorial names like we will name things. So, I want briefly to survey some of these. We don't necessarily know all of them, but the sheep gate is known most likely as the sheep gate because that's where the sheep came into the temple area. Hence, sheep gate, all right? Again, they're not real creative in how they name things, so it's sort of many times just the obvious. Fish gate, what do you think the fish gate goes to? Okay, it would be the gate that goes out toward Joppa, toward the coast, from which then the fish would tend to come into town and so forth. So it's sort of the quickest route by which the fish would come in from the sea. The gate of Yeshana, we're not sure what that one is. This one's at a bit of a loss, so I won't even pursue that. Then you have the gates that Valley Gate, of course, goes into the Western Valley, not the Eastern Valley, but none the Western, the Tyropean, otherwise known as the Cheesemaker's Valley. This is fairly well filled in now. Most people don't really notice it because of all the debris accumulation inside of it. Then there's the Dung Gate, which really bugs a lot of us because of the way we tend to use this word. This basically just means trash. All right, so this would be the gate out of which the trash would be taken and sort of dumped into the ravine. This, by the way, is sort of the beginning part of, down this direction, is the beginning part of the Valley of Hinnom. And so this probably plays into some of the dynamics of that in the narrative. Then there's the Fountain Gate, which goes to the fountain probably in Rogale, which continues slightly off the bottom of this. And people would go through the Fountain Gate in order to get to that spring, which is further removed from the water supply than Gihon. Then we go up the other side. Then there's the Water Gate. We'll come back to that one. Brother Winkler talked about it, and I'll chat more about it. I think most of the speakers have referred to it. Then there's the Horse Gate. Don't know why it's called a Horse Gate. Maybe people horsed around there or something. The East Gate is sort of self-explanatory. It's on the east side. And then you have the Muster Gate, which is where the prison is. And these are the gates that the book of Nehemiah will discuss. Now, some of these are slightly open to question as to where they are, why they are, and so forth and so on. But the gates are important in all of this. Now, here is a picture of the excavations at the Water Gate. Again, one of the speakers last night referred to this as not Watergate in the 60s. All right, not to be confused with Nixon or anything like that. And doesn't look like much, so I've tried to superimpose on that what this apparently looked like. This is the section over here we're not sure about, but all of this we're quite confident on the layout, so let me back that off again. It looks like a mess, and archaeology often is a mess. And then this is superimposed on it, not in an exact, precise way, but close enough. There's the main gate that goes into the city, and the Watergate courtyard area apparently is down here. All right? Now, that's to the east of sorts, and then you have this sort of to the west. Actually, it's more like southeast and northwest. Now, this is an artist's rendering of what they think the Watergate looked like. The courtyard area would be the area over here where they apparently gathered to do their reading. But why is it called the Watergate? Well, they would come out the gate through the opening and make a right-hand turn going out along the edge there to eventually the Gihon Spring, which is the main source of the water supply for the city. So on this other map, there's the Gihon Spring, and the Watergate is situated right here, looking across the valley to the other side, among which would be a view of the Mount of Olives and so forth. So as people would exit out the gate here, they would walk along the edge down to the Gihon Spring, which is obviously a bit of a tedious task. But again, they didn't have running water like we're accustomed to. They would have to go out, fill up their jars, bring them in. Now, please realize people didn't use water to anywhere near the degree that you and I do today. We waste water like it's nothing. But people in the ancient world, oftentimes the estimate is something like a maximum of 5 gallons a day per person. That's it. I mean, everything, which isn't really very much. And a good bit of that would be eating and drinking and so forth. So the Watergate is the scene where the reading of the law begins to unfold. But there's opposition to the work that comes into the picture. I mean, very overt, very, very powerful opposition. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites. If you look at all these passages, it's not just the 4 individuals, but the 4 individuals that are precipitating others, the 3 individuals that are precipitating others into this rebellion and this uprising. But you'll notice the Ammonites and Ashdodites are not Israelites, so they're sort of sucked in from the periphery as the enemy of the state as well. And so Nehemiah is going to have to deal with them. The strategies, just quickly to enumerate these, the strategies are ridicule them. That's always a fun thing to do. That's almost always a first line of attack when people are trying to undermine the integrity of this. And the way they describe this is really interesting. Chapter 4, verses 2 through 4. And he said in the presence of his brothers and the army of Samaria, What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Well, it took 52, but anyway. Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubble, burned ones at that? And then Tobiah, the Ammonite, was beside him and said, yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, it will break down their stone wall. Now, I don't know if you remember the movie The Christmas Story. You remember the movie The Christmas Story? These two guys I picture as the bullies in that show. There's the main bully and the toad. Okay. I think Tobiah is the toady dude. And he's the one that makes the remark about the fox crawling up. But anybody that would say anything about a fox going up on a wall and the wall falling down obviously is sort of implying that the wall is nothing. It's frail. Well, the Israelites are going to have to deal with this. And they're dealing with this ridicule. Then you have an attempt at a planned armed conflict, which fortunately Nehemiah doesn't get sucked into. There are attempts at internal discouragement, trying to get the people to think in terms of their other folks outside of the country, outside of the city, that might need attention and protection. Then you have an attempt to distract Nehemiah from his role by getting him down into the plain of Ono. And of course, oh no, he's not going. And so Nehemiah refuses to get sucked into that attempt. They accuse him of treason, chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. I like this one. This is sort of cool. And I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's an odd phraseology. It is, in it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it. What's that mean? Is Geshem such a big individual and Geshem also says it? It sort of like seals the fate of all of this? This rumor says it, and Geshem also says it. But they're accusing him of treason and certainly attempt at internal conspiracy. None of this is going to be successful. Now, these enemies, very quickly, which I'm already being told is very quickly, the enemy we do have some evidence for outside of the pages of the Bible. Sanballat is referred to in passing in a narration from southern Egypt. At Elephantine Island, there was an excavation at which they found remnants, found a cache of letters that had been written back to Jerusalem and so forth, and to Samaria. And in this is one of them unfolded, and here's part of the site, and there is part of a floor of this structure that's under consideration. And they're asking, that they had a temple down at the southern part of Egypt, and the temple's been destroyed, and they're asking for permission to rebuild it. They've written letters to Jerusalem, trying to get the priest of Jerusalem to give them permission to do it, and they haven't received any information from them. And so they write to the authorities in Samaria, trying to get the folks in Samaria to give permission. And then they finally write to the priest in Judah, trying to get the governor of the area to give them permission to rebuild the temple. And finally, the response is, you can rebuild the temple down there in Jerusalem, down there in Elephantine, on the condition that you don't offer any sacrifices on it. But here's the reference. Because of this, we have written to inform you, we have also set the whole matter forth in a letter in our name to Delaiah and Shelemiah, the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. So Sanballat has become the governor, certainly is the governor of the area. And these letters refer to this. This is the plan of what they think the temple looked like, another drawing that is there. But this was all destroyed, and they're hoping to rebuild it. But they're not given permission either by Jerusalem or by Samaria to do so. But in Samaria, back quickly to the two sites, Gerizim and Ebal, this is the temple on top of Mount Gerizim, to which the woman at the well refers. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, but in Jerusalem is where you say people should worship. Here is the site of Shechem. There is the Jacob's well, and here is the well in the church there at Sychar. It's at this well where that conversation unfolds. Tobiah, we know from at least a family name, over in the territory on the east side of the Jordan River, and there is a tomb that has the name Tobiah written on it. And all of the individuals will argue this at least is the family tomb associated with the Tobiah that's referred to in the book of Nehemiah. Geshem, the Arab, comes into the narrative. And notice that the city of Lachish over here. Now there's Lachish. Jerusalem is situated up here. And at the excavation at the site of Lachish, one of the real massive structures on top of the tell, which you see in a closer view up on the black and white photograph, has this platform and the remnants of this palatial structure there. This is part of that platform. Very well built. Very well built. And it is thought by most scholars that this probably was the capital area with which Geshem was associated as governor of that section. And in the excavation, one of the column bases is there, which obviously shows, not that I'm the best of scale, but obviously shows this is a huge column base that is available, and that's the one that is standing right there on the left-hand side. In the excavations at Tel Maskuta in Egypt, they found this silver bowl that has an inscription on the edge, and it says, Keanu, the son of Gashmu, which is actually the way his name would be spelled in Semitic, the king of Kedar. We have references to these other individuals in other sources other than the Bible. There's no reason at all to question the credibility of the biblical text of these opponents. Now, most of these don't give any indication of conflict between Nehemiah and them, but nonetheless, we know they lived, we know they existed, and the storyline certainly dovetails perfectly well with what otherwise we know. Do I have a minute? 1 minute. All right. This actually is the last slide. Nehemiah is going to make, actually it's not, but I'm going to make it the last slide. Nehemiah, one of the things he's going to do is try to take care of the poor, those who are being oppressed, those who are having taxes exacted on them and they can't pay them back. This ostracon does not necessarily address that problem, but it certainly shows that the people of the time and in the Old Testament period were sensitive to the need for care for the poor. The Bible frequently talks about this. The book of Amos talks about it extensively and repeatedly in the pages of the Bible, in the Proverbs and a host of other passages. But there is legislation in the book of Deuteronomy and Exodus where God talks about if the poor person comes to you and they come to work in your field and they leave their cloak with you at the beginning of the day, you be sure to give it back to them at the end of the day, because if you don't, that may be the only thing that they have to keep them warm, and God says, I will remember. Now, this is an ostracon that dates from the time of Josiah, admittedly before Nehemiah, but Nehemiah is sensitive to the same problem. And this ostracon is exactly of that scenario we talked about. This man has worked in a field. At the end of the day, he goes to get his cloak back, and the owner-manager of the field refuses to give the cloak back, and he asks the governor of the region to write a letter, or he has a letter written to the governor of the region asking the governor to intervene to help him get his cloak back. Now, there isn't a reference explicitly to the Deuteronomy or Exodus passages, but it's written in such a way that as if everybody knows you don't do this kind of thing. It's sort of common knowledge that it's improper to behave in this fashion. And in a sense, that's exactly the way Nehemiah comes back at the scene. As people of God, we ought to know how to behave toward others. And may I say that same principle ought still to characterize us as the people of God. We ought to know how to treat others. And if we're not doing what we ought to be doing, similar to what was described earlier, where's the response? I thank you for your kindness.